For my lecture for Chapter 2, I really want to focus on the part of this chapter that discusses the idea of comparative advantage, specialization, and trade. So before we start, I think it's really important for this to have the book handy and also perhaps to have the PowerPoint handy as well. So you might want to pause this lecture at this point and make sure you've got the book and the PowerPoint with you so you can follow along a couple of things I want to talk about in detail. First thing I just want to mention, though, is that the book has a discussion of this idea of efficiency, and in particular, the difference between economic efficiency or technological efficiency and economic efficiency. When we talk about technological efficiency, we're talking about something, say, like miles per gallon on a car, right? The idea that a particular car is sort of technologically better than another because it can go farther on a gallon of gas. But that's not the same thing as economic efficiency, right? Economic efficiency is the answer to the question, is it worth it? Are the additional benefits of something worth the cost? So for example, just because a car gets better mileage doesn't mean it's the more economically efficient choice. If you have a large family, you might not be able to fit in a small vehicle that gets really good mileage, or if you live out in the country, you might want a vehicle that does better off-road or things like this, all of which, right, might make for less good gas mileage. So gas mileage isn't the only thing that we care about. Economically efficient, it really is it worth it? Are the benefits worth the cost? So keep that in mind as we go ahead and we begin to talk about this idea of specialization and trade. So imagine now, to take the example from the book, that we have two folks who are interested in, who are brewing their own beer. Right? We have Jones and we have Brown. It turns out Jones is a very experienced brewer. He has been doing this for a while. Brown is relatively new. And if we look at what they're capable of doing over, say, a 3-month period, we can see that difference in skill. And if you look at the textbook or at the PowerPoint slide, the first one that shows the difference in what each one of them can produce over 3 months. And we can look and see that over a 3-month period, Jones can produce 5 gallons of stout or 10 gallons of lager. Over that same 3-month period, Brown, again, who's not as good, can produce 4 gallons of stout or 3 gallons of lager. And one way we can illustrate this idea is with what economists call a production possibilities frontier. And this is in the textbook. If you have the book, you can look at page 25. But I'm reprinting it here, right, in my little handy marker board. And what I want to point out here, right, is that we can see for Jones, right, he faces a trade-off. He can produce at one end 10 gallons of lager, that's the L, but if he wants to produce stout instead, he'll produce 5 gallons of stout. You can see our straight pinkish line there connecting the 10 and the 5. Brown, of course, who's not as good, faces a trade-off as well, but a smaller one, right? Brown can produce 3 gallons of lager or 4 gallons of stout. And that line, that's a pink line towards the bottom on Brown's side, reflects the trade-off that Brown faces. So that's a production possibilities frontier. That tells us the limit of what each of these two folks can produce. Okay? But the question we want to answer here, right, is who's more efficient? Who should do what? How should we divide up the production of lager and stout here? On first glance, it might look like that Jones should do all the beer, right? Jones is better at both. Jones can produce more stout and more lager than Brown can. But when we think about for a minute, right, if we say, is Jones more efficient at both, we have to remember that for economists, efficiency is always a benefit in comparison to a cost. So in order to answer this question, we have to compute opportunity cost. That is, we have to figure out who is more efficient at which one. That is, who can produce lager or stout at least cost. And again, if you follow along on the PowerPoint, you can see that slide number 7 here, right, offers us an opportunity to do this. If the question is, what's the opportunity cost, right? So for example, if we say of Jones, okay, if Jones decides to spend all of his time producing stout, right, he produces 5 gallons of stout. What does Jones give up? What is the opportunity cost of doing that for Jones? The opportunity cost of that for Jones is that Jones gives up the 10 gallons of lager he could have produced. That is, for every 1 gallon of stout Jones produces, he gives up 2 gallons of lager, right? For every 5, 10, every 1, 2. So the opportunity cost of producing stout for Jones is 2 gallons for every 1 gallon of stout is 2 gallons of lager. And if we think about it the other way, what's the opportunity cost for Jones of producing lager? It's just the reverse. If Jones produces 10 gallons of lager over those 3 months, Jones gives up 5 gallons of stout. That is, for every 1 gallon of lager, Jones gives up half a gallon of stout. Okay, and we can show that again. If you flip to slide 8, you can see those numbers being put into the table there. And Brown, we can do the same sort of calculation. If Brown produces stout, what does Brown give up? For every 4 gallons of stout, Brown gives up 3 gallons of lager. So for every 1 gallon of stout, gives up 3/4 of a gallon. And then in reverse, we can see that when Brown just decides to produce lager, Brown gives up 4 gallons of stout. That is, so for every 1 gallon of lager, 4/3 of a gallon of stout. And again, if you have the PowerPoint with you, you can click over to slide number 9 and you can see this together. So when we have all this together, we can now see all those opportunity costs in one place. And the question is, who produces which at relatively lower opportunity cost? Who is the lower opportunity cost producer of stout? Who is the lower opportunity cost producer of lager? Okay, and when we do this comparison, we want to work vertically down that column. So the opportunity cost of stout. Who is the lower opportunity cost producer of stout? Well, Brown gives up less stout, gives up less lager when producing stout. So, for example, when Jones produces stout, he gives up 2 gallons of lager. But when Brown produces stout, Brown only gives up 3/4 of a gallon of lager. Okay, so it makes sense here for Brown to produce stout because Brown gives up less. Brown's opportunity cost is lower. And if we look at the last column there, we can see that, not surprisingly, Jones should be producing lager. When Jones produces lager, Jones only gives up half a gallon of stout. When Brown produces lager, Brown gives up over a gallon, 4/3 of a gallon of stout. So Jones is the lower opportunity cost producer of stout. Brown is the lower opportunity cost producer of lager. This idea, this sort of relative efficiency here, this idea that we want to allocate production to the person or to the organization who does so at the least cost, is what we call in economics comparative advantage. What we say here is that Brown has a comparative advantage at producing stout. Jones has a comparative advantage at producing lager. Now, we know that Jones is better at both. If we talk about an absolute advantage, who's better in an absolute sense? Jones is better. He's been brewing longer. He's just more experienced. He does both better. But if the question is who does which one comparatively best, that is, who's most efficient at either one, who does each one at least cost, right? That's this notion of comparative advantage. And when we look at comparative advantage, right, we can see that Brown is relatively more efficient and can produce lager at lower opportunity cost. I'm sorry, can produce that. See, this is what happens all the time. That Brown can produce stout at lower opportunity cost than Jones, and that Jones can produce lager at lower opportunity cost than Brown. That's what we call comparative advantage. Now, why is this idea of comparative advantage important, right? That's what we really need to see here, okay? The reason why comparative advantage is so important is because this enables us to see the way in which specialization and trade benefit everyone. So what's going to happen here, right? We're going to have each of these two brewers specializing in one or the other. So for example, if we go this way, right, what we end up seeing, of course, is that Jones specializes in producing lager, produces 10 gallons of lager. Brown produces 4 gallons of stout. But what's the problem here? The problem here, now Jones has all the lager and Brown has all the stout. They might not be happy with this. They might prefer a world in which they have some lager and some stout. They're both beer drinkers. They like both kinds. So what can they do? How can they help solve this problem? Jones has 10 gallons of lager. Brown has 10 gallons of stout. What can they do? Of course, well, they can trade. And let's suppose here that they decide, they run into each other at the beer store, they start talking, they realize one's produced one, one's produced the other. They decide to trade 3 stouts for 3 lagers. So originally, right, where Jones had 10 lagers, he's now given up 3 of those to Brown, right? Jones will now have 7 lagers and 3 stouts. And in return, Brown has given up 3 of his stouts and acquired 3 lagers from Jones. So Brown now has 1 gallon, 1 stout, and the 3 lagers he's acquired from Jones. So now they have a mix, right? But what's interesting about this mix and what's important about this mix, and if we go back to our production possibilities frontier, we can see this. Right? And if you turn again to page 25 in the textbook, you can see this in particular. Because now what we have here is we've said Jones has 7 lagers and 3 stouts. And if we look at that production possibilities frontier, we notice something interesting, right? What we notice here is that point in blue, right, where 7 and 3 that Jones has, is beyond his original production possibilities frontier. That is, one way to see this is that by specializing in trading, Jones is able to consume more than he could produce by himself, or at least consume a combination of beers that's that gives him more than he could have produced himself. And by the way, the same is true of Brown. If we look over at Brown, we can see that Brown has given up one of Brown stouts, and in turn for 3 lagers, right? And that puts Brown at a position like this one right here. All right, having given up the 3 of the stouts and acquired 1, and left with 1, and now having 3 lagers, Brown is also at a position that is beyond his original production possibilities frontier. And we can see that that's true of both of them. Again, what's important about that is that the fact that both of them were able to specialize in the thing that they did relatively best, specialize according to comparative advantage, and then trade with each other, enables them to consume more beer, a bigger bundle, bigger combination of beers than either one of them could produce themselves. And this is a crucial truth we see anytime that we trade. The fact that I specialize in producing economics knowledge, right, and other people specialize in producing beer or sweaters or whatever it is, enables us to do the things we do best and to trade, and enables me to consume more than I could produce myself. If I tried to sew my own sweater, if I tried to make my own shoes, if I tried to grow my own food, if I tried to even brew my own beer, I wouldn't be very good at it. But by specializing in the thing that I do best, most efficiently, and then taking all of that I produce and trading some of it with others. And in the real world economies, of course, we don't barter directly thing for thing. We trade, we sell our services or our goods for money. We turn around and buy other things. But the result is the same, right? We're able to consume much more than we could produce if we tried to do it all by ourselves. And this concept is important in a number of different ways. We've been talking about it in terms of individuals producing, but the original theory was developed in terms of what countries do. And so when we think about trade among countries, right, the fact that the United States might be better at producing lots of different things than some other country doesn't mean we should do it all ourselves. Other countries, or more specifically people in other countries, should produce the things that they're relatively best at and trade with us. If it makes sense for you and I to trade, to specialize in trade. If it makes sense for Indiana and New York to specialize in different things, or California and Montana to specialize in different things, it makes sense for the United States and China, or the United States and Mexico to specialize in different things and then trade. We are all made better off when we produce the things that we're most efficient at and trade with each other. When we start to draw circles around ourselves, right, imagine trying to create all your own food and your own clothing and your own shelter. You would not be very successful at that. You would be impoverished by doing so. The ability to trade with others enables you, again, to consume more than you can produce yourself. That's true among individuals. It's true among cities. It's true among counties. It's true among states. It's true among nations. Specialization in trade is the way in which we enrich ourselves. And I encourage you to watch the 3 Trade is Made of Win videos by my friend Art Carden that are listed here, to really understand this concept in more depth and to see the way in which we all benefit when we specialize and trade.